that we might want to mention that was popular in the 60s because of the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union and the scares that came from the Bay of Pigs and that kind of thing regarding nuclear weapons. My dad was very much a contact person for the civil defense. The civil defense operations became very interested in ham radio operators, and specifically because my dad was kind of famous around here for that, they became interested in him and talked to him about being a contact for civil defense operations. And the civil defense, those of us that are children from the 50s and the 60s, there was always, the big scare about nuclear bombs and that kind of thing. And we even remember having to do the duck and cover when we were in elementary school, where the siren goes off. That means that, that's a warning that there may be a bomb, and we had to get under our desks. So that was duck and cover. And I have one piece of equipment that I remember he used when I was a kid, and it looks like a ballpoint pen. This is it. Even has a little attachment on it. And my dad, the original typical nerd, of course, had the pocket protector with his pens. And he also had this little thing that looks like a ballpoint pen in his pocket. And it has the little civil defense logo. And this is an instrument, it's made by Landsverk, and it's called a dosimeter. D-O-S-I-M-E-T-E-R. And he would take this instrument out of his pocket, and I remember him holding it up to the air and looking through it. And if you look through it, you will see a grid, and it has the term Rontgens, which is the measurement of radioactivity in the atmosphere. And so he would take this little, I always thought he was like a James Bond type. My dad was really handsome too, so I thought, he could be the other James Bond. But he had this little instrument that reminded me of all the stuff that James Bond had, and he could hold it up to the atmosphere and tell you how much radiation was in the atmosphere with just this little ballpoint pen thing. It's in its original box. It's from Glendale, California. Their address, by the way, if you want to contact them, is Glendale 1, California. And it's called a radiological dosimeter. And it's got warranted against defective materials and workmanship. So the original box is here. As far as I know, he never had to measure radiation. I don't know how to use it to this day, but I still have it. I think it's really cool. Still think it's really cool. I've got it in case. I forgot to mention earlier what you call letters. Ham radio operators have their own call letters. And my dad's was K4YBN. And I remember when he was calling out, actually voice communication, when he was on the radio and calling out for contacts, you always announce your call letters, K4YBN, and then at the time, the names, which also the military would use in their communications, would be, my dad would say K4YBN, K4 Yankee Baker Nancy. And those were the terms that you would use to clarify the letters in your call letters. And something else I wanted to mention along with that, in order to prove that you made contact, especially when you started using code and contacting people not only all over the United States, but around the world, in order to prove that you talked to these people, you had to exchange what they called QSL cards. And QSL cards were really just a postcard type item. and if you made contact, you would write down the frequency, the band, and your call letters and the call letters of the person that you talked to, and then put it in the mail. So when he started communicating with people all over the world particularly, he had two files. He had a file of QSL cards from his contacts here in the United States, and then he had another file, which was a wooden box that he made, of QSL cards from all over the world. And of course, they were in different languages when you got the QSL cards. And that's when I started collecting stamps, because he got the actual stamps on the postcards and the letters and that kind of thing, just, you know, to document his contacts, and they as well. But we would get stamps from all over the world, and I decided, you know, somebody needs to keep track of that. So I had started, when I was a kid, I'd started a stamp collection as a result of that. But I did want to talk about his call letters and that kind of thing, because that's how you get to know one another. Not necessarily by your name. Eventually they know your name, but your call letters are more important than your name, and it identifies exactly where you are and who you are, and how many times they've talked to you, and that kind of thing. So the other thing I wanted to mention is the fun part of being a ham radio operator, and that is ham fests, which is like a huge nerd technical flea market that my dad participated here in the Southeast. I have pictures from Knoxville, Tennessee was a big one. He also did the ones here in Asheville, and he would go to Virginia, Bluefield, I think it's Bluefield, Virginia, Knoxville, Tennessee, Greenville, South Carolina. There were some things further east in North Carolina. Greenville, North Carolina was huge simply because of Voice of America, which back in the 60s and the Iron Curtain in those days, Voice of America broadcast out of Greenville, North Carolina. And they also had contacts with my dad because of the civil defense operations. But the thing that brought all the ham radio operators together in the Southeast, and the big one was in Atlanta. And I do have some pictures of in Atlanta. And they would either meet in a huge civic auditorium or outside if the weather was good in the parking lots. You know, the bigger the better. My dad started out first out of the back of his car, which was a Mercury Capri, one of the first American cars that it was actually made in Germany. It was a really cool car. I eventually inherited it, but he started doing his ham fest out of the back of that car, and that's my mother sitting there. She's doing her quilting, because she would sit there and mind the store, so to speak, and do her quilt squares and sell stuff out of the back of the car. Eventually, when they started doing the big ones, they were either in the warehouse. This is the Greenville Ham Fest, Greenville, May 1982, and I mean Greenville, South Carolina. They're inside, and that's my mother there again, minding the store, coils of copper wire, that kind of thing. I've got another story to tell you, a little personal story about the copper wire. And then here they are in a parking lot in Atlanta, which was the big one. He was right next to a semi. So just to give you a perspective about how important these things were and people getting together. And most of the time they wouldn't buy things, they would simply trade. So it was important to circulate and look at people's stuff, and then talk about what you had, talk about what they had, and then you would make a trade. You would barter. And so, you know, he'd get everything from, he had this huge spool. I guess it was a huge spool of copper wire and also brass wire as a separate one. And he would spend his days, and my mother would help him, and I helped him a couple of times, just rolling off amounts of that copper wire, and so that there would be smaller amounts that people could buy. And it was electronic copper wire to be used for, it was graded and to be used for electronic projects and that kind of thing. I have a clock, a mantle clock, that he traded for one of the last ham fests that he did, and it still works, and it chimes every hour and half hour. That's why I don't have it running. But he traded for a mantle clock, so things started to expand at these ham fests. When my dad passed away, we started out talking about call letters and how important they are. My dad passed away in 1990. One of the members of the club here, he was a young guy, and I don't remember his name, but your call letters get retired, and this young fellow applied and got my dad's call letters, just to save that. And he liked my dad a lot, and he wanted to have my dad's call letters. So there's a guy out there somewhere, sorry, don't remember your name, but he has my dad's call letters, K4YBM, which is how we started this conversation. Fun part of being a ham radio operator, you get to not only talk to people all over the world, but you get to meet some of them if you go to these big ham radio fests, and trade for things that might not necessarily be technical, like an antique clock. And you also get to make jewelry out of wire and use the tools that your dad used when he was building his electronic equipment. So that's the story about my dad and his involvement, and hopefully you'll find it interesting.